All right, our next speaker is Katherine Haile from Oklahoma State, and she's going to talk a little bit, follow up to some of the things that Sam talked about too, I think, and add to what he was talking about. So it's all yours.
Yeah. So like she said, my name is Katherine Haile. I'm a second-year master's student at Oklahoma State University, and I am going to be following up a little bit of what y'all heard already, but adding to that a little bit and digging a little bit more into the research of what's already been done with patch burning. So the title of my project, for my master's project, is The Effects of Fate, or like what might be a little bit more productive. However, prescribed fire is often applied across an entire pasture, which many of you may know or maybe even practice that yourselves. A specific type of prescribed fire is the patch burn grazing or Pyric herbivory, which we've talked about already. Maybe I'll click forward, there we go. And we've talked about this a little bit more, but I just want to reiterate. Get it on the right slide to start off with. So what patch burning does is you only burn a portion of a pasture at one time, and you have grazing pressure in there before, during, and after a burn. So on our perfect little pasture right here, we burn, this is burning like about a quarter of a pasture. The patch size, I think I heard somebody ask that question earlier, the patch size depends a lot. It depends on your pasture, your total pasture size, how many animals you have, the pasture layout, lots of different factors can play into the patch size, including trying to utilize natural fire breaks, which we did in this research as well. Lots of different factors, and it's not really instrumental in the actual practice of patch burn grazing. So with this, you burn just a portion of the pasture. You still have the cows in there, and they have access to those areas. Then you follow up that burn by burning another portion of the pasture. And you can see the cows in this scenario are preferentially grazing for that most recently burned area, and also pulling their grazing pressure away from other areas of the pasture that haven't been burned yet. This is a very slow response rate. There we go. So we continue rotating that fire through the pasture, and the cows continually follow up that fire by grazing more heavily on the most recently burned patch. And you can see they still have access to the other areas, including the fourth and final patch that we haven't burned yet. But they're not really selecting for that very much, because I'll talk about why in here in a minute. But they're focusing more on those most recently burned patches, which gives us more fuel for our fourth and final fire in this rotation to round out that patch burning rotation in that pasture. And patch burn grazing and Pyric herbivory are sometimes used interchangeably. Patch burning just refers to burning a portion of the pasture. Patch burn grazing is the interaction between cattle grazing and those burned patches. So it's kind of the interaction versus the actual act of doing it. A little bit more about patch burning, which we've talked about before and other people have mentioned. It does affect cattle distribution, as we saw earlier. Cattle select for the most recently burned patches, and they've been shown to travel about 1,600 meters or about a mile away from water to graze on those recently burned patches. This is likely due because of the increased vegetation quality on those recently burned areas. So the fresh regrowth is more palatable, has a much lower leaf to stem ratio, so the leaves of fresh regrowth are much more palatable, higher quality, compared to the standing vegetation that's been out there for multiple growing seasons exposed to elements. And not as palatable, not as high quality compared to that fresh regrowth. So we do know that the cattle will select for those recently burned areas and that it is higher quality, but we want to dig a little bit deeper into that and see if we could actually modify grazing distribution to refocus cattle to known avoided areas. So see what areas of an unburned pasture are avoided because of whatever reason, maybe distance from water, rougher topography, just older vegetation that's not very palatable, and try to refocus that grazing to those areas, strictly using fire. Our other objective was to dig a little bit deeper in the nutritional quality of the vegetation. So most studies that have looked at vegetation quality typically quantify crude protein and NDF, ADF, like Jonathan talked about earlier. So those are pretty common elements, and those are very important in looking at the palatability of a forage, but there's also many other elements of a cattle's diet that's important out on the rangeland. So we looked at a total of 10 macro and micro minerals on this native range forage. The study site was located at the OSU Marvin Clemmy Range Research Station out in western Oklahoma. It's right in between Clinton and Bessie, if you're familiar with that area at all. It's In the midgrass prairie, which was Jonathan's study site as well, like he said, there's multiple grass species within that ecotype. You have shorter grasses up to mid-grasses and tall grasses interspersed within the same areas. The mean annual rainfall is about 79 centimeters or 31 inches per year. And then we used 3 separate pastures for this study, and they range from about 46 to 90 hectares, or 110, 2 of them were 110 acres. The third one was about 240 acres. So relatively small pasture sizes compared to what some people may deal with, but it's also pretty typical for that area of western Oklahoma. We used a pretty low stocking rate, 5 cows per pasture. The reason for this was we wanted the cows to have free choice of where they wanted to go. So if there was an area of the pasture that they, for whatever reason, didn't want to select for, they had free choice to go other places to meet their nutritional needs. So to give you a little timeline of how we conducted the study, we started in July of 2020, is when we first put the cows out there pre-burn prior to any fire. And then we left them out there through that growing season, took them off with the first frost in about late October. Using the downloaded GPS data from the cows, we determined which areas were avoided and selected 4, created our burn units based off that data, and then conducted a total of 2 burns, a spring burn and a summer burn, in March and June respectively. And the cows were put out there right after the spring burn in the first part of April. During that same summer, we also did 3 vegetation sampling sessions starting about 2 months post the spring burn so that we could track those vegetation changes through time. And the cows were out there through the duration of that and were removed from the pastures at the end of the growing season again in late October. For our GPS tracking methods, we used I Got You GPS units. If any of y'all are familiar with that, you may be more familiar with like low-tech collars, which can be very expensive to use on a larger scale. These units are meant to be used for more personal use. You can throw them in a backpack, take them with you when you go hiking, and it'll track where you go. But they're a much less expensive option, and we could refit them with external battery packs to greatly increase their battery life. So this setup right here can last for about 6 months, taking a GPS point every 10 minutes like we did for this project. And you can see the setup here. So this is the unit itself. These are the 2 battery packs. And that just fits in the little plastic container that mounts on the cow collar. For the vegetation monitoring methods, like I said earlier, we did 3 sampling sessions, and for that we took 3 samples inside the burn unit and 3 samples outside the burn unit, a good ways from the burn, but close enough so it would be similar grasses, similar species to what would be in the burn unit. To collect the species, we used a quadrat, so a Doppelmayr frame, and then recorded the species composition by cover classes, and then clipped and weighed those samples. Using those samples, we dried them to find the biomass, ground them, and then sent them off to be analyzed for protein, fiber, including NDF, ADF, NFC, TDN, or total digestible nutrients, as well as the 10 different micro and macro minerals. For selecting the burn patches, so this is a hotspot analysis done on one of the pastures. We had a total of 3, but this one really illustrates the responses to the fire. If y'all aren't familiar with a hotspot analysis, it basically just determines which areas contain the most GPS points and therefore had the most, the cattle spent the most time in those areas with more GPS points. And those are delineated by these red areas. The blue areas had fewer GPS points, and so those were selected against by the cattle. The kind of wider tannish areas that you can see throughout the rest of the pasture are not significant, so they weren't selected for or against during the pre-burn summer. And this was a larger pasture at about 240 acres. So we placed the burn units, like I said, in those avoided areas. Primarily in the avoided areas, we also had to go into the not significant areas somewhat, just because of trying to get about a 5-acre burn patch for all of them, utilize natural fire breaks and roads whenever we could. That's why you see some of these are a little bit odd shaped, like this one right here was a pretty easy one to conduct because it was almost bare ground and roads all the way around. So that one was a pretty easy one to do, but that's why it's so odd shaped. So it doesn't have to be a perfect square in a pasture if you want to do patch burning. You can loop it around however you want to make it fit in your pasture the best. So these 2 here that are yellow, it's kind of hard to see on this. It's like Jonathan said earlier, the screen looks a lot different than the PowerPoint does. But these two were burned in the spring, so in March. And then these two were burned in the summer, like I said earlier, in June. So this shows the transition from pre-burn to post-burn. And the burn units are outlined on each map. You can see where we placed them in the avoided areas previously, have now almost exclusively, with a little bit of variation, turned to hotspots. They significantly selected for those areas based on before they were significantly selecting against those areas. To break that down in a little bit more detail, we also did an Ivlev's ill activity index on the data. And what this does is takes into account what percentage of the cattle's time they spend in each area based on what percentage of that area made up what was totally available to the cattle. So if you had a 20-acre patch and the cattle spent 20% of their time in that patch, or if the total patch is 20% of the area, the cattle spent 20% of their time there, that's not really selecting for or against. Just kind of by chance, that's what they would spend. So right here is the March burn or the spring burn. And you can see about 3 weeks after that burn, they start really selecting for that recently burned patch. And after about week 12, 13, we also did the June burn or the summer burn. And you can see the selection almost flip-flops. So they were selected against the longer time since fire, or the longer time since fire burn, and we're really focusing on those most recently burned areas in that pasture, which is the green bars or the summer burns. The unburned areas, which they're kind of hard to see, I'm sure they're really hard, especially in the back. They kind of oscillate back and forth across that middle line, and that's the unburned areas. So those were kind of very slightly selected for and against throughout the duration of the summer. For the vegetation nutrition responses, our first one is crude protein, and we saw much higher crude protein levels in the unburned areas compared to, or in the burned areas compared to the unburned areas. It was about 2.5, almost 3 times as high, about 2 months post-fire, or 1 month post-fire, sorry. And that was similar 3 times since fire, but it also began to decline and eventually returned to unburned levels after about 6 months. Phosphorus, which is one of the minerals that we tested for, it had a very similar response to crude protein. And you can just see that line. It's almost straight down, like right after fire, it's much higher compared to the unburned areas. But as you go through time, it eventually returns to the unburned levels after about 6 months. The other minerals had a similar response, though phosphorus really illustrated that well. In the spring burn, in the burn versus unburned areas, 2 months post-burning, 6 minerals were significantly higher in the burn versus unburned areas. And then 4 minerals were statistically the same in the burn versus unburned areas. After about 4 months, that changed just slightly. So we had about 7 of the 10 minerals that we tested for were higher in the unburned areas compared to the, or higher in the burned areas, sorry, compared to the unburned areas, with the remaining 3 being about the same in both areas. However, like we saw in the 2 graphs, after 6 months, or 6 months after the spring burn, in those burn patches, all 10 minerals were about the same in both areas. For the summer burned areas, we'll look at those similarly 1 month post-fire, so the vegetation sampling was a little bit off. We did the vegetation sampling at the same time for all 3 months, but that was a little bit different time since fire because the burns were staggered. So 1 month post-burn, we had 7 minerals that were higher in the burn versus unburned areas, and then the remaining 3 minerals were about the same in both areas. 3 months post-fire, changed a little bit, so we had 6 minerals that were higher in the burned areas and 4 that were lower, or 4 that were about the same. And this picture here shows one of the burn units about a couple months post-fire. You can see it's starting to really recover well. Lots of good green, palatable regrowth on that. So in conclusion, did we meet our objectives? We were able to make the cattle select for those known avoided areas just by using fire. So like we saw in those 2 graphs, we changed the significantly avoided areas to significantly selected for areas. All what was blue and within the burn patches turned red after fire. And then also the forage quality and mineral responses were much higher in the burn versus unburned areas. not only with the crude protein being much higher, and I didn't show you the graphs, but also ADF and NDF were lower, which is higher quality right after fire, but began to decline. But also many of our minerals positive responded to the fire. However, that only remained for about 6 months. So in conclusion, just to kind of wrap up and have y'all have a few like little take homes, you can better manage grazing patterns with fire. So not only can you place a burn patch in a pasture randomly and they'll select for it, you can also find known avoided areas for whatever reason, be it topography, or in our case, the areas were typically avoided, I think, from just because of the older vegetation that was there that was lower quality. So you can burn those areas and then draw the cattle to those areas and then also away from other areas. So in the map, many of the red areas in pre-burn shrunk or maybe even disappeared post-burn because the cattle were spending more of their time on the burn units and less time in other areas of the pasture. Lastly, you do need, in order to receive the highest nutritional benefits from fire, you do need it about twice per year, every 6 months, because like we saw after about 6 months, most of the nutritional qualities had declined. So though they were much higher right after fire, and Dr. Fullendorf talked about this in his talk yesterday, with the lowest biomass or sooner time since fire, you had the highest quality. But with more biomass, more recovery time, you get lower quality. So to receive the highest nutritional benefit in this system at least, we would say you would need about fire twice per year, though that's not always feasible like they've talked about. Like some can't always get fire on the ground twice per year, but to get the most benefit from burning and most forage benefit, it would be about twice per year to expand that season out. And with that, I'll take any questions. Yes, ma'am.
So your pre-burn cold spots.
Yes.
I'm curious, was your vegetative makeup of each of those similar?
Yeah, so the question was what the vegetation makeup was of the avoided areas of the cold spots. It was pretty similar. Many of the areas that we burned were lots of little blue stem that were about thigh high or hip high. So though little blue stem is a really good grass, after several seasons, it's not super palatable. Like it's hard to get to that base where all the good vegetation is. So yeah, a lot of it was similar across the pastures. More or less, it was some variation. But yeah, most of that was just older vegetation that they didn't have to eat, so they didn't. Yes, ma'am?
What's the impact on forms?
So we looked at that as well. So the question was what the impact on forms was. For our cover classes, we did it by species as well as vegetation type, so grasses, forbs, and woodies. And actually, the forbs were about the same cover-wise. We had 1 month where it was a little bit higher, but after about 6 months, everything had pretty much returned to unburned levels. Some studies have found that the forbs are a little bit higher. Some studies found that they're a little bit lower. I think it depends a lot on the fire intensity, season of fire, location of what your forb response will be.
And that's over years?
For years, it would. So eventually it would return to what was out there.
It would,
Right.
even though the cows are grazing down
Um,
areas?
yes, as long as the stocking rate's not super intense, if you have like the correct stocking rate, they will graze it for a while. But after it returns or matures enough, if you don't have too many cows out there where they're just hammering it, it'll eventually mature and they'll quit selecting for it. They'll go to other areas of the pasture. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
I'm curious about the stockwater location, if you were able to relieve the pressure from that, with the patch grazing.
We did. So the question was how the grazing distribution around the water was affected. We looked actually about how patch burning affected the grazing distribution within riparian areas, but it was a little bit tricky for my stuff. So like this, if I can go back very slowly. Our second year was a little bit wetter. We got more rain in the springtime. So we had a lot more natural water. Here we go. Go to this one. So we had a lot more natural water. This was where our water trough was at the first year and the second year as well. But After the second year, we also had water back in here, so there's a big riparian area that runs back in this area. And then there's also a tank over here, or a pond or tank. So we had actually a lot better water distribution in the pastures the second year compared to the first year, just because of precipitation differences. And we actually found 2 of the pastures had less of the cattle's time was spent in riparian areas the second year compared to the first year in 2 of the pastures, but in one of them it was much higher. And so we really can't say specifically if the patch burning affected the grazing distribution in the riparian areas or not, or necessary water, because it was a lot different from one year to the next. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Kind of follow-up question on that. Has anybody studied, or do you see anything you're studied, does the quality of forage a cow is eating, does that affect the amount of water they need to drink, or how often they need to drink? Does that change at all?
Yeah, it would. So if there's more, so the question was how the vegetation quality affects how much water they need. Typically, your higher quality forage most likely is going to have more water content, so it's going to be fresher growing. There's less dry matter actually in that forage and more water content. I don't know like the specific best scientific answer to that, but I would say they would need less water on a higher quality diet, just because there's inherently more water in that forage compared to a lower quality forage. And if anybody's interested specifically in those mineral responses, I do have the full table of all those mineral responses, but that was way too much for a presentation. None of y'all want to listen to that, I'm sure.
Any other questions? All right.
All right.
Thank you,
Thank y'all.
Catherine.